Guillaume, can you see the audience?
Yes, there are 15 participants. Can you see them?
No.
I can see the number and it's just gone to 16. I can't see them, but I can see the number.
Participant 16, yes. I can't see the names. But hello to everybody. We might be. It's a 1:15.
I think we can start to be on time. Okay, so maybe let's go. So good afternoon and good evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Guillaume Vallet. I am Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Grenoble, France, and I will chair this session. Thank you for the audience for attending the meeting, and of course, thank you to the three speakers of the day for accepting to present the paper in this session. This session is devoted to the issue of inequalities during the progressive era in relation to the recent publication of my edited book entitled Inequalities and the Progressive Era. So here is the book. This book, which contains 22 chapters written by international scholars, is divided in three parts. The first deals with the foundations of inequalities. The second copes with income, capital, and land inequalities. And the final part is about social inequalities. The book seeks to capture the complexity of inequalities during the progressive era. And the progressive era, it is worth reminding that the progressive era covers a period starting from the 1890s and ending in the 1920s. And we can say that there are three intricate patterns of the progressive era, namely industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. As its name suggests, the progressive era calls to mind a large raft of policy advances which dramatically transformed American society. Although that vision truthfully reflects a tangible historical reality, we cannot view the progressive era as unfolding smoothly over time. All in all, this period was a double-edged sword for Americans, namely an era characterized by deep changes and continuity, by great and unprecedented opportunities, but also by rising inequalities. In this regard, the progressive era was a turning point in the sense that it saw a shift in the perception of inequalities among all the key sections of American society, of course, but also of other societies elsewhere in the world. Today, four speakers will present a paper on this period. I will begin with a paper on Albion Small. Afterwards, Annie Cott, full professor of economics at Pantheon-Sorbonne University, Paris, will present a paper on Richard Ely and the labor problem. Thirdly, Robert Dimand, full professor of economics at Brock University, Canada, will present a paper on a neglected author, namely Stephen Leacock. Finally, Steve Meardon, associate professor at Bowdoin College, Maine, will deal with Henry George. From the bottom of my heart, I really want to thank these three eminent scholars who accepted to present a paper in this session. Each participant will present their paper during 20 minutes, and then we will have a time for questions for the remaining time. So I will begin starting with the presentation on Albion Small, which is in fact a paper I have co-written with my colleague in Grenoble, Virgile Chassagnon. I will put it in full screen. Okay, so let's go on Albion Small. Small was the founder of the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago in 1892. He was also educated in political economy because he followed the courses of some German historical schools economists, and in particular Schmoller and Wagner. He was also influenced by Richard Ely, who was maybe his most important mentor in political economy. Today, I will shed light on Small's neglected views on inequalities following this presentation. So you can see here is a portrait. He was very elegant on this picture. And I will deal with the issue of inequalities in the 4 parts. First, I can say that Small was particularly concerned about inequalities stemming from capital concentration, because these types of inequalities are viewed as hindrances for each individual to realize their self through their own labor, from which individuals almost exclusively derive their identities according to Small. The progressive era witnessed a rise in capital inequalities, shedding light on the labor and industrial question. According to Small, because of the rise in this type of inequalities, time was ripe to change industrial organizations and more broadly workers' conditions in order to change income and wealth distribution. According to Small, dealing with capital concentration meant dealing with the industrial question, and then to rethink the cooperation between the 3 factors involved in the production process. Small did not call for the collectivization of means of production in the hope to solve the problem of capital concentration. Likewise, Small believed that profit was integral to capitalism. In fact, Small wanted to fight what he called the over-profit. To that aim, Small distinguished 3 forms of capital, arguing that the degree of control over the use of capital should be proportionate to the extent to which the labor or the contributions of people other than the owner are required to make the capital productive. This is why we can find in his writings 3 types of capital. The first one is a tool capital, which is used by its owner only. The second one, which is maybe the most important in Small's views, is the management capital, which is used by the owner in some part, in some sort of dependence upon the acts of others. So this is the most important because the use of this capital implies to work with the cooperation between workers and capitalists. And finally, another important type of capital, namely finance capital, which refers to banking credit or finance in general, and which should be regulated in Small's views. So in sum, finding ways to increase the share of management capital is key, since this means new distribution and new types of cooperation between workers and capitalists. This is very important in small views because this will prevent class warfare from arising, which is maybe one of the most important things he had in mind. Because, as mentioned earlier, capital concentration is a threat to economic efficiency on the one end, but also to democracy on the other end, because this capital concentration gives too much power, too much economic power to only a few people. And the problem is that this power would translate into political power, preventing people from realizing their equality of opportunity. This is why we can present now what Small had in mind to change the system and to solve this problem related to capital concentration. I would like to remind here that Small was an evolutionist because he believed that there were different stages in the history. Small firmly believed that changes implemented by the state would increase the global welfare and promote cooperation between individuals. This is what he called the socialization stage. This socialization stage was a stage in which the state would implement policies aiming to foster cooperation between individuals, then including workers and capitalists. And in order to reach such a stage, Small proposed a three-step approach. First, to set up the equality of rights. So it was very important in his view, and maybe this is what he shared with other progressives of the time, because for him, it was a condition to improve the moral order. The law creates categories rendering visible what is invisible. So this is very important in order to implement new types of policies. Second, as we said, but here more specifically, Small was in favor of the creation of cooperative councils operating within companies. This was a way to reshape the relationship between workers and capitalists. Through these councils, workers and capitalists would reshape the concept of property, reconsidering tool capital and management capital while avoiding problems arising from the concentration of finance capital. Moreover, still in this second point, Small wanted workers to sit on the boards of directors of companies in order to foster democratic principles within these companies. This is in line with the idea that partnership goes hand in hand with representation. So this is a way for him to increase industrial democracy within companies. And finally, according to Small, taxation is a matter, because taxation is a matter of general interest, time was right to rethink tax policies and then to implement new tax on capital in order to decrease capital concentration. Small suggested in particular the following 5 measures aiming to reduce capital concentration while ensuring capitalism's permanence. Through these measures, Small sought to preserve profit while fighting over profit, as I mentioned earlier. Taxation would compel capitalists as well as the state to take workers' interest into consideration. on the one hand, the state needs to rely on capitalists to finance its policies through taxation. Capitalists are indispensable in as much as they can fund social programs. But on the other hand, taxation of capital should be sufficiently high to check the power of capital in order to prevent problems from arising, especially regarding the reality of democracy. So to conclude my presentation, I can mention that in my view, Small's ideas still ring true today, because maybe for three main reasons. First, because I think that his work enables us to rethinking the nature of capitalism and its dynamics, and this is in line with his views on evolutionism. Second, and maybe this is a more concrete issue, I think his work addresses the issue of the nature and the frontier of property, in the sense that being the owner of a capital, the capital of a company, for instance, is not the same that being the owner of the whole company, of the whole nature of company. And maybe this is very important to have this in mind to rethinking the social responsibility of companies, for instance. And finally, I think the main lesson from Small is that inequalities stemming from capital concentration exacerbate class conflict, and this could become harmful for the whole functioning, of course, of the economy, but of course also of democracy. And today, with the rise in inequalities in several countries, I think that these lessons are very useful. So thank you very much for listening to me. And here are two books dealing with Small and other progressives of this period. Thank you very much. I leave the floor to Annie. Annie, you have to unmute yourself.
Is it okay now? You hear me?
That's okay. Yeah.
Hello, everybody. So my paper is on Richard Ely and the labor problem, which is one specific way of dealing with this question of inequality during the progressive era. And I shall go a little bit earlier than the progressive era, because as we shall see, Ely began to write in the Gilded Age. Wait, I cannot with this. Yes. So let me begin by Ely's anger at Paul Homans at a round table of the American Economic Association in 1931, where he addressed Homans, saying the first reaction Ely has about Homans' presentation of institutionalism is sheer ignorance of the history of economic thought in general, and especially the history of American economic thought. Institutional economics began in this country in 1885. So far as I am concerned, says Ely, I have to say that I am an institutional economist or I am nothing. So the departing point of this paper is that Ely was right. The movement that he initiated with some other young rebels who also were trained in Germany was the matrix, among other things, of American institutionalism, the American Economic Association, and labor economics as a specific subfield, subdiscipline within economic theory. A few milestones on Ely. Ely was born in 1854. After some studies, he moved to Germany, like some others, like John Bates Clark, like Carter Adams. He moved to Germany for 3 years, where he studied under Karl Knies, under some important authors of the second German historical school, mostly Karl Knies Adolf Wagner and Ernst Engel, Wagner and Engels being specialists in statistics, and this will play a role in my story. He returns to the United States. He doesn't have any job. He tramps in the street of New York. He's appointed at Johns Hopkins. And then he joins the group of what was later called the Young Rebels. You have the pictures here. Henry Carter Adams, Seligman, Simon Patton, and others. 3 years after, he writes The Labor Movement in America, which is the first important book that I shall rely on in order to study Ely and the labor problem, knowing that he will change some of his opinions after the publication of the labor movement. In 1885, he launches and takes the lead role in the American Economic Association. We all know that. What is more important is that he definitely insists upon the fact that the model is the German Verein für Sozialpolitik, and the statement of principles, which will be removed a few years later, includes point 1 and 3. We regard the state as an agency whose positive assistance is one of the indispensable conditions of human progress. We hold that the conflict of labor and capital had brought into prominence a number of social problems whose solution requires the united efforts of the church, the state, and science. A few years after, he was hired in 1892 by the University of Wisconsin, where there is one of the first trial on academic freedom, begun by an article of Newcomb on the labor movement in America, published by The Nation and read by Oliver, read by the new superintendent of education of Wisconsin. There's this trial. Ely is not so courageous at the trial, saying, well, if what you accuse me of being, which is if I had been a socialist, you would be right in denying my right to teach, which is a weak position, but I'm not a socialist, I'm not an anarchist. We know the story. He brings one of his former students, John Roger Commons, and Wisconsin begins to be one of the major centers for the study of labor and industrial relations in the States. And he finishes his career at Northwestern. The labor problem. Basically, there is first a labor problem. The most strong facts is that by the beginning of the 20th century, 80% of the workers were employed into the industry and not in agriculture. And the awareness of this labor problem, what became a social and political problem, is linked to two major factors, which is first, the rise of statistics, labor statistics. Carl Wright was the head of the first Bureau of Labor Statistics in Massachusetts, and labor statistics was vastly disseminated and discussed. And second, social movements who for the first time in 1877 came to a national audience by the Great Railroad Strike. Of course, on this basis, trade unions developed very fastly, and the first trade union organization to whom Ely devoted some love declarations was Powderly's Noble Order of the Knights of Labor, what we call the Knights of Labor. Ely began to work on the labor with two different strong points. First, the idea, which was not expressed in North American economic theory, is that labor is not a simple commodity, is not a simple factor of production. And the second idea is that labor is a central piece for the new institutional, which was not the word which was used, but the new economic theory that Ely wanted to replace from towards both the classical and the marginalist theory. These two characters enlighten four major conflicts and quarrels of the time: theoretical quarrel, religious quarrel, methodology quarrel, and the question of expertise and the performative role of economic theory. Theoretical quarrel is based on what Ely calls Ely's call for a new political economy and his attack against what he calls the dry bones of standard American economics. The major books for these first attacks is The Labor Movement in America, where Ely denounces the following fallacy: the assumption that labor is a commodity like other commodities. And hence, in opposition to standard economics, he offers to build a new field of economic theory upon this specific commodity, which is of course bought and sold, but which has some moral characteristics which forbids to take it as a standard commodity. And hence his accentuation on labor organizations as the expression of labor. The book was very harshly attacked. I mentioned the role of these attacks on Ely's first academic trial by Arthur Perry, by Newcomb, by Farnham, and of course defended both by some of the young rebels like Tausig, Clark, and Seligman, and the gospel authors. And this is my second point: a religious quarrel. In a very nice paper on the social gospel and economic theory, Bateman and Capstein write that the most influential lay leader of what came to be named the social gospel was Ely. Ely attended the first conferences organized by Gladden and Heron during the 1880s. In 1889, he publishes Social Reform and the Text, which is a manifesto in favor of a Christian reform in matter of labor legislation. And I usually disagree with Murray Rothbard, but basically I agree with this quote. Ely believed that he served God by transforming the social sciences and enacting progressive policies. He launches the American Institute of Christian Sociology, and he manages to convince most Protestant churches to adopt a document called the Social Creed of the Churches, where they committed themselves to support a living wages for all workers, to end child labor. I remind you that child labor was only abolished, or at least was the object of a law in the United States in 1938, which is extremely, just a century later than most European countries. Third basic quarrel, I cannot see the time on this, on my computer. So Guillaume, you have to tell me.
You have 9 minutes.
Good, perfect, thank you. The third quarrel is a methodological quarrel. Ely was one of the first to import from the German historical school a strongly inductive methodology. So one of the first criticisms he addresses to both the classical school and what was not named the marginalist school at the time, but the mainstream school, was on what he calls dogmatic extremes of deduction. And he argues in favor of an inductive methodology, taking back within economic theory the lessons of both the German historical school and the lessons of statistics, observation, experimentation, what he calls the look and see method. The word is a bit too simple, but he develops that. Basically, this methodological question is important concerning the labor problem, because experiments for him is a way of rejecting all types of dogmatism. An experiment, this is the quote from his 1884 paper on the past and present of political economy. Experiments for him is the way to advance in a matter of economic policy step by step. So Ely was strongly attacked for his support to trade unions, but was a very reformist supporter of trade unions and absolutely antagonistic to the revolutionary movements within the trade unions of his time. And this inductive methodology is what is stated in the American Economic Association's second statement. We know that Ely was the one who drafted them. We believe that political economy is a science and still in an early stage, while we appreciate the work of former economics, as to historical, statistical study of actual conditions of economic life for the satisfactory accomplishment of that development. So the methodological quarrel was extremely strong. The fourth point I wanted to insist upon is a quarrel on the necessary performative role of economic theory, or in other words, the necessity for an expertise by economic theorists, which is not just an expertise in matter of analyzing social policy, but which is a normative role devoted to economists, which did not exist among most of the United States economic theorists of the time. So in his first writings, Ely mentions the necessity for this normative involvement of economists, and quoting the Germans, Hildebrandt, Nies, Wagner, Rocher, Hengel, Émile de la Vallet, the Belgium, Cossa, the Italian, Cliff, Leslie, and the Webbs in Great Britain. So he relies very strongly, not only on the methodological aspects of the historical school that developed all over Europe, but he relied on the necessity of an involvement of economists, which did not exist before that. Three illustrations, three examples in the field of labor economists: the launching of the Bureau of Industrial Research, this is well known, the writing of pamphlets and articles in general press, which again did not exist. Most of the American economists wrote for academic journals. There is, after this harsh strike at Pullman's, he goes to Pullman's, he makes a study on the basis of the German historical school methodology, and he publishes an article in Harper's Magazine criticizing the Pullman system of paternalistic patronage. And of course, the third one is his work with Fighting Bob La Follette, Governor Robert La Follette. We all know about La Follette, who was first deputy, then member of the parliament, then senator, then a candidate to the presidency of the United States. But basically what McCarthy, who was also teaching at the University of Wisconsin, called the Wisconsin idea, was elaborated by Ely, then together with John Roger Cummins. So there was this unofficial brain trust, which worked for many years with basically the global aim of social control of inequalities on 3 points: the fights against monopolies. Guillaume mentioned Albion Small on the question of concentration, which was a theme under John Bates Clark, Ely's. They were all discussing the question of concentration. Second, a state system of income tax. And third, which is of more interested for my paper, a reform program on labor right, inspired by German experiments, and more so even because you had a lot of German workers from German origin in the Wisconsin at that time. It was really the first time, long before the New Deal, that this Reformation brain trust succeeded in implementing public utility regulations, labor legislation, a workman's compensation law, a minimum wage law, and so on and so forth. So basically, what can I conclude of this very short presentation? First, and there I rather disagree with my friend Malcolm Rutherford, institutional economics did begin with or even before the launching of the American Economic Association. Richard Ely did lay the basis for what will later become the School of American Institutionalists. Second, his views on the labor problem, Ely's view, contributed to establish the subdisciplinary field of labor economics as a specific field, which was definitely a reformist field and extremely institutionalist, quite different from the labor economics domain, which developed in Europe at the same time. Second, to enhance the role of statistics as a rhetorical device in the analysis of labor relation. Third, to change the nature of economic theory on the concept of labor. And finally, to construct the role of economic experts, both within the academic world and outside. This role did not exist before. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Annie, for this presentation. It was insightful as usual, so thank you very much. So now the floor is given to Robert Dimand. Annie, you can stop sharing your screen. Perfect.
Well, thank you very much. This is a session about American economics in the progressive era, but American is not synonymous with United States. North America is more than just United States in it, and we're going to be talking about the most widely read, most influential Canadian political economist and social scientist of the progressive era. Now, he was writing in Canada, but widely read far beyond. So, for example, the book whose title I include in the title of my presentation, The Unsolved Riddle of Social Justice, not only was it a book, but the entire text of it was serialized was published in the New York Times in a series of 6 articles. And, many economists do not get their books published in full in the New York Times. I mean, New York Times has rather high standards for getting space. And so this Unsolved Riddle of Social Justice, it came out in the New York Times in 1919, 6 articles. Now, Guillaume mentioned that I'm going to be talking about a neglected economist, which is absolutely true. But I'm going to be talking about the most famous and most widely read neglected economist anyone has ever heard about. It's just that he's famous for something other than being an economist. So at the time, he was very influential as an economist. So Stephen Butler Leacock, here's a picture of him. He was known as Canada's Mark Twain, except that when the International Mark Twain Society gave him the Mark Twain Medal, they called him the modern Aristophanes, which is, not something that most economics professors would be described as. And he's the best-selling humorist in the English language from 1910 to 1925. I mean, that's the heyday of P.G. Wodehouse, and he's outselling Wodehouse and everybody in the United States. But nonetheless, his day job is that he was the head of McGill University's Department of Economics and Political Science. He started teaching there in 1901, and then 7 years later, he succeeded Alfred Marshall's student, A.W. Flux, Sir Alfred Flux, as the William Dow Professor of Economics and Political Science, and he was the Dow Professor of Economics and Political Science from 1908 to 1936. And the multidisciplinary nature of the appointment is important because it led not only the general public to think that Leacock was an economist, but it led Leacock himself to think that he was an economist, which is something that, for example, A.W. Flux would have denied. But, you know, because Leacock got the appointment as a political scientist. As a political scientist, once he's appointed professor of economics and political science, he's got economics in the name. He was born in England, but his family moved to Canada when he was 6. The important part of his intellectual formation is that he did a PhD in political economy at the University of Chicago, and most of all, that he was studied there with Sorstein Veblen and with James Lawrence Laughlin, who was upholding the economics of John Stuart Mill long after Jevons and Marshall had published. So Leacock is a very incisive satirist and a social critic like his teacher Veblen. So it's very much important that he has his Veblen connection. But there's a difference between Leacock and Veblen because there are two varieties of satire in Leacock's writing. When he writes about his Arcadian adventures with the idle rich, or when he denounces the economics profession in his book, Elements of Economics in Hiccups of Verse, done in our social planning mill, he's as sharp and even bitter a satirist as Veblen. But then in his book that's of most lasting fame, Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town, you get much warmer humor where he's praising and upholding the rural values that were abandoned by the urban bureaucrats in what he calls the Mausoleum Club and the tame academics of Plutoria University. Though it must be said that his neighbors in Orillia, Ontario, where he spent summers, didn't find the satire as gentle as Leacock later readers believed it to. It's also notable that among the academics at Plutoria University, there's one whose lectures are a parody of Sorstein Veblen's lectures. So Veblen is not just a satirist, but he's a target of satire. Nonetheless, he's very widely read as a political economist in the progressive era. He's not a progressive in either the US or the Canadian sense. In the Canadian sense, but not capital P progressive. In Canada, the capital P Progressive Party is what would in the United States have been called the populists, not the progressive. But he's also a serious teacher and a thinker. And his best-selling book was not any of his humor books, but his textbook on the elements of political science, which was translated into 18 languages, used as a textbook outside the world, outside even the Sunshine Sketches. Unsolved Riddle of Social Science appeared in the New York Times. But the Unsolved Riddle of Social Science, a very serious attempt to look at social unrest after World War I and to advance a program of social reform as an alternative to socialism. He published it with the same publishers, same 3 publishers, one in the US, one in Canada and Britain, as is another book, Winsome Winnie and Other New Nonsense Novels. And of the 2, it's Winsome Winnie that went into 8 editions. That is what made him famous for. Because of his humorous writings, he got to publish very, very widely on politics and economics because he was well known. So Saturday Night Magazine was the leading weekly magazine in English Canada. One of the issues in December of 1910 had 2 articles by him. One, Gertrude the Governess, and an article about bimetallism, which is the 5th of a series of 25 weekly articles by Leacock on practical political economy. So he's publishing 2 books, a humorous one and Practical Political Economy, as a series of articles. no other economist, social scientist, professor in Canada is going to get a series of 25 articles in Saturday Night magazine. I mean, they're lucky if they get one. But it's Gertrude the governess that becomes famous. It's one of its most quoted line and made famous by, of all people, Theodore Roosevelt, who one would not think of as having enormous influence in the world of humor. And it's about the lovelorn Lord Ronald, who flung himself from the room, flung himself up on his horse, and rode off madly in all directions. And still a widely quoted line about riding off madly in all directions. So I'm going to be talking not just about Leacock's views, but about his extraordinary career, the extraordinary role that he played in political economy and social science in Canada, because it is such a paradoxical career as an extremely famous, neglected economist. And his standing as a public intellectual and as a humorist, it's really the result of happenstance. It's two people are responsible for it. Two people quite fortuitously interfering in his life. One is Earl Grey, the Governor General of Canada, the grandson of the Earl Grey, who was British Prime Minister when slavery was abolished in the British Empire, and the one for whom the tea is Earl Grey tea is named, who turned Leacock into a public intellectual. And then a few years later, an English publisher, John Lane, the father of the Alan Lane, who founded Penguin Books, turns Leacock into a best-selling humorist. So in 1905, Lord Grey asked McGill University for somebody to give 6 lectures in Ottawa, the national capital, about the British Empire. And they sent him Stephen Leacock, who spoke in favor of Imperial Federation, which was then being proposed by Joseph Chamberlain in Britain, denounced the Monroe Doctrine. In fact, one of Lord Grey's one reservation about the lectures is that Leacock should not step so much on the corns of your neighbors. He felt the lectures were too anti-American. And Leacock also called for the creation of a Canadian Navy, which is not the policy of the Canadian government at the time. The Minister of Defense actually stood up at the lecture and argued with him. And so Grey then wanted to turn Leacock loose as an imperial missionary. And so he asked McGill University to give Leacock 2 years leave to go around the world lecturing about the British Empire. McGill University only agreed to 1 year. So Leacock went off. He lectured in Montreal, in London, in Oxford, in South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Vancouver. And his lectures were described by Rudyard Kipling as just what was needed, and they were described by Winston Churchill as offensive twaddle. Churchill being then a Liberal and the Undersecretary at the Colonial Office. But when Leacock returns from his world lecture tour, this is just when Alfred Flux is leaving McGill for the British Board of Trade. And that lecture tour has established Leacock as the obvious successor to Flux as a Dow Professor of Economics and Political Science. Leacock had published his Elements of Political Science. He published in the American Political Science Review. He was a member of the Executive Council of the American Political Science Association. But Flux had grave doubts about Leacock's ability to teach economics. He wrote to Sorcine Veblen asking whether Leacock was actually qualified as an economist as well as a political scientist. And you can imagine how Veblen would reply. It amused Veblen greatly to be entirely evasive in answering that. And here, I have to disagree with Crawford Goodwin, the great historian of economic thought, who began as historian of Canadian economic thought. Crawford wrote that it was really unfortunate that because of his job, Leacock was forced to teach economics, a subject that he disliked, disapproved of, and had no theoretical competence in. Well, in fact, Leacock fought vigorously for the right to teach a subject that he disliked, disapproved of, and had no technical competence in it. Flux tried to stop him. Leacock insisted. Sometimes it is said in the literature that Leacock must have been a good teacher of economics because Jacob Viner was his student, but Jacob Viner has described Leacock's teaching of what Leacock considered to be advanced economics as a farce, but he said in contrast that Leacock was an entirely competent teacher of political science, and that you could tell the difference because Leacock only used humor in the economics classes. He used humor to slide over his limitations as an economist, but in political science classes, he just taught political science. Well, in 1910, John Lane found himself about to get on a ship from Montreal back to England and looking for something to read. And he picked up at a newsstand a copy of Literary Lapses, a collection of humorous sketches that Leacock had self-published after Houghton Mifflin, his textbook publisher, had rejected it. It includes my financial career, Leacock's story about his attempt to open a bank account. And this led him to this accident of John Lane picking up the book led him to an accident of about 60 or some books, hundreds of articles. You'll notice here, not the typical books for an economics professor. Moonbeams from the Larger Lunacy, Winsome Winnie and Other New Nonsense Novels, The Garden of Folly, Literary Lapses. So he becomes very, very famous. And because he's famous as a humorist, he can publish on anything else that he wants to. He gets enormous space for his serious writing. So his book in 1937, after My Discovery of the West, which is a tract against social credit in Alberta, and it won him the Governor General's Award for Nonfiction. It was also published as a series of 27 articles in the Globe and Mail, Canada's most prominent daily newspaper. I can't see any economics professor now getting a series of 5 articles accepted in the Globe and Mail, never mind 27. But he had a problem that when I stand up before an audience to deliver my serious thoughts, they begin laughing. I've been advertised to them as funny, and they refuse to accept me as anything else. So in 1933, he turned down an offer of $1,000 plus expenses to entertain the American Bankers Association in New York City. He offered to speak at his own expense on the restoration of the gold standard or some equally important subject, but they weren't interested in that. His alma mater, the University of Chicago, kept inviting him back over and over again to speak, always on literature. They never let him speak about economics or about political science. He's reprinted. He's in print now, published by New York Review Books, the book publishing arm of the New York Review of Books. But what are they publishing? They're reprinting his nonsense novels. And John Kenneth Galbraith, who is Leacock's successor in depicting small life in small town Ontario. John Kenneth Galbraith reflected that humor is richly rewarding to the person who employs it. It has some value in gaining and holding attention, but it has no persuasive value at all. So this was the great paradox of Leacock's career as a political economist. He could get attention because he was a renowned humorist, but he couldn't persuade anybody of anything because he kept being perceived as a humorist. And he's not exactly a progressive, as he explains here. He's actually a liberal conservative or a conservative liberal with a strong dash of sympathy with the socialist idea, a friend of labor, and a believer in progressive radicalism. And that is about as concise a summary as can be provided. So his most serious book on social reform is the Unsolved Riddle of Social Justice. And the context of it is he's writing it in 1919 and it revised as a book in 1920. Canada has the Winnipeg General Strike in 1919. It's also, of course, the Seattle General Strike and Boston Police Strike. There's the wave of unrest and change throughout the world following the World War I, the Russian Revolution, and there's, of course, a pandemic at the time, the influenza pandemic that killed more people than World War I. And World War I had more Canadian casualties than US casualties, even though the US population is 14 times as large. Canada had participated in the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War. And here where we get the Progressive Party, the populist discontent in Ontario in the West brings the United Farmers of Ontario to had just come to office, and soon it would be the United Farmers of Alberta and the Progressive Party in Manitoba. And the country had been literally divided between Quebec and everybody else over conscription. And in that book, Leacock, though, I mean, he's an imperialist and all that, he talks about the obvious and glaring fact of the money power, the shameless luxury of the rich, the plutocrat, unfettered by responsibility, seems as rapacious and remorseless as the machinery that made him. And here we have, as a prime example, his wife's uncle's place, his Casa Loma, the never completed downtown Toronto castle that his wife's uncle, Sir Henry Pellet, built. Sir Henry Pellet had a great talent for spending money, far exceeding his talent for making it. It's now a tourist attraction, but at the time, it did not seem to be the most socially useful way of employing wealth. Now, Leacock did not idealize the past. He said that only false medievalism can paint the past in colors superior to the present, but he takes a position that's certainly not that of a neoclassical economist. The real truth is that prices and wages are the outcome of a complex of competing forces that are not based upon justice, but upon economic strengths. He says that socialism is a beautiful dream. Our present lot is sad, but the frying pan is at least better than the fire. But he advocates a substantial program of social reform, public support of the aged and infirm, public funding for sanitation, for housing, for education, for children's nutrition, and it's to be funded by maintaining the extremely high wartime levels of taxation. And production will be privately organized but publicly regulated, including regulation of working conditions, minimum wages, and also the government should accept a responsibility to guarantee jobs for anyone who wants a job, to make public works projects, wages low enough not to compete with private employment. Now, these ideas are largely incorporated in the so-called Bennett New Deal, the proposal made in 1935 by Prime Minister R.B. Bennett in a series of radio talks. Now, he was coming up towards an election. It was sort of a deathbed conversion to progressive reform. But it's noteworthy that that series of talks were published as a book with a preface by Stephen Leacock. So the Bennett New Deal, most of which got ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of Canada and by the Privy Council. Leacock is involved in promoting it, though Leacock very wisely declined Bennett's invitation to stand for Parliament. And also, he's at that point, Leacock is supporting empire free trade, like the Canadian publisher in Britain, Lord Beaverbrook, who wrote to Leacock expressing gratitude and support for his writings. On the other hand, though the Prime Minister is paying attention to him, publishers, outsiders like the publisher Beaverbrook are paying attention to him. John Maynard Keynes described Leacock's economic prosperity in the British Empire as extraordinarily commonplace, and he recommended that Macmillan not publish it in Britain. It had already been published by Macmillan in Canada. Leacock comments on Keynes are no more friendly. He makes an attempt to quote Keynes on the investment multiplier. He garbles the quotation, and as he says about it, I do not know what all that delta and y stuff just quoted means. He hasn't quoted it correctly, but I could write it out plainly and simply. And that mathematical economics is what in criminal circles is termed a racket. Now notice he gets to say this in the Atlantic Monthly, and he also gets to say pretty much the same thing in the New York Times Magazine. So he's an economics professor of economic and political science. He's very critical of the trends of economics. And because he's a famous best-selling humorist, he gets to express these views in the New York Times, in the New York Times Magazine, the Atlantic Monthly, give lecture tours around the world. But also because he's a humorist, people think of him as a humorist and they'll take him seriously. So he's a paradox. He's a British imperialist, what in Canada is called a red Tory, progressive with a progressive reformer, but not with a capital P. And most of all, he's a satirist like his teacher, Weber. He's the head of the
department. Conclusion, Bob?
Excuse me. This is my last slide.
Thank you very much.
This is the last slide. He's heads of the Department of Economics and Political Science. So the public and Leacock himself mistaken for an economist, but he's heading the Department of Economics and Political Science because he's a political scientist. He's a best-selling humorist. He's renowned not just as a humorist, but also as a character. I mean, when he gave his humorous lectures to the public, it was always well known that the water jug in front of him was undiluted gin that was fueling the humorous lectures. So he had a much wider audience than any other Canadian political scientist, including a massive international audience. But his audience assumed that he was going to be funny, which is the paradox that haunted him. He had an enormous audience, and whatever he said to them, they were going to laugh. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob, for this wonderful presentation. And this is a presentation related to a chapter in the book for people who would like to read it. Now the floor is given to Steve Meardon, who is going to present a paper on Henry George.
Thank you, Guillaume. And Annie and Bob, I'm glad to be here with you. And Guillaume, thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this project. We got a couple of comments in the chat I noticed during Bob's presentation, which I really enjoyed. And it looks like a couple people in the audience committed the sin that I myself have been guilty of a couple of times and were unmuted. And so we got a bit of a background noise during Bob's presentation. So I'll ask people, because I don't know how to mute that, and maybe you don't either, Guillaume. If you do know how to mute other people, perhaps you could give it a shot. And if you don't, I'll just ask other people to please mute your microphones. Let me tell you about my paper, The Tariff Question, the Labor Question, and Henry George's Triangulation. This began as a study of Henry George's protection or free trade in relation to the trade doctrines and the politics of the moment. Of this moment. And that explains this juxtaposition that I'm showing you now on my first slide between a tweet of President Trump's and a statement of Henry George's in his protection or free trade. I considered George, and I still consider George, as a historical exemplar of understanding not just what is wrong in the opposing doctrine, but what may be the truth in it that gives it some force despite its wrongness. And I stick with that, but for our purposes, for Guillaume's purpose of understanding how inequalities were treated in the progressive era, I want to say something more than that. I want to talk about Henry George's Protection or Free Trade, written in 1886 at the pre-dawn of the progressive era. this moment that Annie was talking about, when the same moment when Richard T. Ely was writing The Labor Movement in America. What I think Henry George's Protection or Free Trade can show is perhaps something about the progressive era by way of a different way of treating inequality, Henry George's way of treating inequality, which, notwithstanding arguments to the contrary, was, I will argue, not a progressive way of treating inequality. There was an excellent book, very recently published by Columbia University Press, authored by Edward O'Donnell, titled Henry George and the Crisis of Inequality. And there, O'Donnell presents George as progressive. He uses this term in a rather casual way. My argument here, by way of studying the content and the context of protection or free trade, is to the contrary. Henry George was not a progressive. Let me talk a little bit by what I mean by that and what Henry George was doing instead. I'll say this very briefly before I go into a little bit more detail. I'm thinking of progressivism in, I think, the same way that Annie and Bob and Guillaume are doing. I've been especially informed by Tim Leonard, who in some of the first pages of his Illiberal Reformers spoke of some of the qualities of progressivism in this way. Progress, the economic progressives argued, according to Tim Leonard, required the visible hand of the administrative state. Progressives had extravagant faith in administration. Progressives would view the poor as victims deserving state uplift and as threats requiring state restraint. None of this describes Henry George as a study of protection and protection or free trade and the context in which George wrote it, the reasons for which he wrote it, as that all illustrates. The reasons for which he wrote it can be illustrated very briefly in this slide that I'm presenting you with now. What I have here is another quotation from Protection or Free Trade, together with an illustration of it from the Danish edition. Henry George was already famous by this time in 1886 when he wrote this book. It was translated into a whole bunch of languages. And for this Danish edition, there was published this image to begin with, which depicts a metaphor that George used to describe what he was doing in the book. What he saw was the poor, the workers, as being all wound up in this pasture of beautiful, luscious grass. There was no reason why they couldn't be maintained in a good condition, and yet they weren't. And the solution was right before us, but nobody could see it. Somehow the bowl needed to be untwisted from this pole. And George's purpose was to show the bowl how to untwist itself. Not only that, to show the bowl that the way it was thinking about the problem was all wrong. And this was George's triangulation. His argument was that the salient discussions at the moment about the opposition between free trade and protection, about the opposition that Annie characterized Ely as seeing between labor and capital. They were wrong. There was no such opposition that should be considered. At the very least, if we were to understand the real underlying problem, all of this would vanish. And this was George's triangulation. He was trying to set himself in a position between and above labor and capital, between and above free traders and protectionists, showing how both of these sides in both cases had a point, and yet nothing could happen if they got their way. No good could happen if they got their way unless and until they understood George's point. So now I'll go on and I'll talk in more detail about what George was doing at this moment, what he was trying to accomplish, and why we should see George as something different from a progressive, not a progressive after all. The timeline looks like this. I'll go through it really quickly. George was born in Philadelphia in 1839. He went west. He was an autodidact. He studied, took up typesetting and periodical editing in San Francisco. It was in California that he witnessed the beginning of a series of industrial depressions that was the context for his magnum opus, Progress and Poverty, in 1879. This was a time from 1865 to 1885, just before the publication of Protection of Free Trade, of tremendous volatility. In all these 14 years, in fact, according to the NBER Business Cycles Dating Committee, there were 117 months of contraction. So what George finally did in 1879 was to try to rebuild political economy, reconstitute the whole science from sounder principles, and to diagnose the problem and to prescribe a solution. His argument was basically this, as I've quoted on the lower right of the slide: the increasing difference in the productiveness of the land in use, which causes an increasing rise in rent, which he identified as the crux of the problem, results not so much from the necessities of increased population compelling the resort to inferior land, as you might think if you'd taken in David Ricardo, as from the increased productiveness which increased population gives to the lands already in use. There's something wonderful, there's something phenomenal about agglomeration. It helps us, as other American political economists had said, political economists like Henry Carey, it helps us to make ourselves collectively more productive. But the problem is that the rewards of that increased productivity are being drained away, are going all to the rentiers. And this is the problem, and this is what we have to do something about. As he put it, also in Progress and Poverty, if we're all here by the equal permission of the Creator, we're all here with an equal title to the enjoyment of His bounty, with an equal right to the use of all that nature so impartially offers. There's on earth no power which can rightfully make a grant of exclusive ownership of land. That was the diagnosis of the problem, was that we had adopted as an institution private ownership of land, which was endowed by the Creator to everybody, allowing instead the rewards of land to be appropriated by those whom we call its owners. That's the problem that has to be solved by some fundamental institutional reform. He proposed the reform, and probably most of the people listening here have some inkling of what it was. It amounts effectively to public ownership of land. Nominally, according to George, the private owners can retain the title to the land, but title to the land is rendered actually valueless because what he proposes is a single tax of 100% on the annual returns to land. He proposed it. Progress and Poverty made him famous. He went on a tour and was proselytizing for this cause. And it caught on in some corners, but still the salient political conversation was not what George wanted it to be. People were still talking about other issues. They were still talking about, among other issues, free trade or protection very prominently. In the election of 1884, he said that the campaign, having just closed and elected Grover Cleveland as president, would result finally in the struggle that he hoped would begin, the struggle to end what he called industrial slavery by the means that he proposed. His idea politically about how this would happen would be that perhaps the Democratic Party would be split in two by the tariff question. the difference to the masses between a tariff for protection and a tariff for revenue is of little importance. But he thought this discussion is going to involve economic principles. And now finally, when we get to talking about economic principles, people will be made to see that they're talking about the wrong thing. They'll understand George's principles and the conclusions that must be arrived at from George's principles. And this last phrase that he uses of tremendous importance to George and to my thesis. This discussion of economic principles is going to be of the greatest importance in the education of the people. What George proposed was to educate the masses, to make them vote differently, to make them vote for the reform that he proposed, the fundamental reform, which once in place would change everything. Well, the election of 1884 happened. Grover Cleveland was elected. Then within a couple of years, George himself became a political figure, ran for mayor of New York City. And at the same time, he made his contribution to what was, in fact, the salient political discussion of the moment, the question of protection or free trade. And what I've shown you here are two images, one of the table of contents of protection or free trade, the other a representation of what he was doing simultaneously, having meetings, rallies, and spreading the word, which was also supposed to support his own political cause in the mayoral election of New York City. As for the content of protection or free trade, there are a bunch of chapters here, and I think it's useful to group them into parts. In a very large part of the book, more than half of the book, what he's doing is inquiring into what protective tariffs are and how they operate. And then going on to explode protective fallacies. None of this is particularly original, right? None of it. What he's doing is relating back, it's true, to some work that was original, his reconstitution of economic theory and progress and poverty. But then, so far as he uses that in part to explode protective fallacies, by speaking of the fallacy of the balance of trade or imbalance of trade doctrine, the particular problem that an imbalance of trade represents, or the pauper labor argument for protection. And none of this is original. All of this was in the air. It was pretty commonplace. But then he goes on and he makes the original contribution in this book, his discussion of why, under the circumstances, free trade, which he supports. In fact, he supports, he argues, free trade in a way that even the ostensible free traders don't. Why, under the circumstances, free trade won't work. And then he goes on to talk about what will work. Now, why free trade won't work? It's again because although, yes, free trade, as the free traders argue, would result in increasing productivity and the growth of aggregate income on the whole. Nevertheless, what's going to happen as aggregate income grows on the whole is it's a greater and greater share is going to be drained away by the rentiers. What will work is, of course, what George had proposed all along. And it's not what free traders or protectionists are talking about. It's useless, George says, to tell working men that increase in general wealth means improvement in their condition. They know that this is not true. So here again, you see George triangulating. The free traders are largely right, but they're also wrong. Free trade under the circumstances isn't going to benefit the working man as they say it will. But not only is such improvement in the condition of labor nowhere commensurate with the increase of productive power, it's clearly not due to it. It exists only where it has been won by combinations of workmen or legal interference. So far as the free traders are suggesting that unionization and the combination it represents as a form of monopoly that should be opposed, they're wrong, actually. And the workers, the supporters of unions, are right. This is what has benefited, so far as workers have been benefited, this is what has benefited them. But there are limits to this too, and there always will be until we diagnose the problem correctly and implement the cure. So what will work? What will work, he argued, is not what was being proposed. And here's a caricature of what was being proposed by President Grover Cleveland in the election of 1888 that he made even more about free trade or protection than the election of 1884 had been. What Cleveland was proposing to do was to bring down the degree of protection. And the way that the Democratic Party and Cleveland represented this was by a trimming. We weren't going to entirely do away with tariffs, but we were going to trim them down to a reasonable extent. And one could be a free trader and believe this. Henry George is saying, no, this is not good enough. This kind of trimming is not going to do it. The free traders don't really believe earnestly in their own doctrine if what they propose to do is trim down tariffs to the extent of having a tariff for revenue only. What we really have to do is eliminate tariffs and replace them with the means of public finance that he had proposed already in Progress and Poverty. A political economy, he said, that will recognize no deeper social wrong than the framing of tariffs on a protective instead of on a revenue basis, and that with such trivial exceptions as but a justification of things as they are is repellent to the instincts of the masses. When the masses reject the free traders, they actually have reason to do that. So he says what true free trade means is the abolition of revenue tariffs as well as of protective tariffs. And in striking at indirect taxation in general, what we're going to do is sap the very foundations of aristocracy. That's what will work, according to George. I'm going to arrive already at my conclusion and speak again briefly about how to read protection or free trade in relation to this larger project of Guillaume's Inequalities in the Progressive Era. I do see protection or free trade as a rhetorically effective and in part sophisticated reminder. Actually, it's the political part of protection or free trade that's sophisticated. I think it's George himself is more sophisticated in theory in Progress and Poverty. But there is some sophistication in protection or free trade, but it's, as I say, it's in the politics of it. It's in the triangulation that it does. It's good to read protection or free trade as a rhetorically effective and sophisticated reminder of why the most prominent protectionist logic is fallacious. It's a recognition of the actual facts about inequality and the persistence of inequality that shows why the fallacious logic that he's opposing, in this case, the fallacious logic of protectionism, is nevertheless saleable. There's a kernel of a point in it. And so restrictions of trade, whether international or domestic, are used understandably as a second best solution to widening income inequality. Understandably, that's not to say that they should be, but he's understanding why they are used in this way. And the reaction of people against the pretensions of expertise at this time, in the pre-dawn of the Progressive Era, the expertise of free traders, who would say that restrictions of trade are just harmful, period. The reaction of people against the pretensions of these experts is understandable. It's even well-founded. But the remedy, and this is the really crucial part, the remedy is the education of the masses. The remedy is to educate them so that we create a popular movement for a fundamental institutional reform, which then doesn't require this cadre of experts to administer it. We're not going to transfer power from the people to the experts. What we're going to do is convince people, persuade people to vote for this fundamental reform that then doesn't require in Tim Leonard's words, characterizing the progressives, the visible hand of the administrative state to operate. So ultimately, what does protection or free trade do for the purposes at hand? I think it illuminates the progressive era by contrast. It shows what progressivism is not. It shows an unprogressive way of thinking about income inequalities and the solution to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve, for this insightful presentation. It was excellent. And once again, it is related to your chapter in the book. And I can understand now better why there are some differences between Small and Henry George, for instance. So thank you very much. Now the time is ripe to open the session to questions from the audience. So maybe people can raise their hands and I will tell their questions, or I can also unmute them, I don't know. But we already got a question, Annie, for you. It was a question in the chat from Cléo Chassonnery-Zaïgouche. Do you have it? Can you see it?
I don't find the chat. Yes, I do. I have it.
Okay, thank you.
Elise, the answer, I don't know if Cleo is here. I can't see the list of the attendant. Ely is an extremely complicated figure. I focused on the first part of his work and on the labor problem. He became much more, well, I already mentioned that during the trial, he was not extremely courageous. It was a bad moment for him. His daughter had died. Well, I'm not entering the detail. It's not interesting. But he became rather conservative. What I do think that the American Economic Association owes him is that he was really instrumental in launching the association. You could, it was a more left-wing way of launching the association. After a few years, some other young rebels opened up, abandoned the first statements, opened up to standard economists, and then after opened up to Sumner and Sumner's crowd. But Ely was undoubtedly the major figure in launching the association. If you had to name a distinguished lecture after somebody in the American Economic Association, Ely would be the right name, but it's not the it's not. The second part of the question is more interesting. The ad hoc committee noted that although Ely made positive contribution to economic thought, he also wrote approvingly of slavery and eugenics. Yes, of course, I told you he was becoming more conservative. Of slavery and eugenics, on immigration, he held the position of the trade unions, both of the Knights of Labor and the AFL-CIO. Of course, but at the time, there were very few economists who raised their voice against slavery and against eugenics. Against eugenics, well, you had a few women, pacifist women, you had a few Jewish immigrants, but most of the Native Americans were in favor of eugenics, against immigration. Slavery was a more complicated subject. So on the one hand, yes, Ely was the founder, but it's the same debate than kicking off statues. Also, one could argue that it is part of history, and I would prefer that there is an explanation of Ely's role on slavery and and eugenics. Otherwise, there is nobody left in this whole group. I mean, Irving Fisher, as you know, was definitely keen on eugenics, and most of them, the only two who were not, in my knowledge, but maybe Bob Dimand will know more about that, who were not on the eugenics and anti-slavery part were John Bates and John Morris Clark.
Thank you, Annie. Yes, as far as I am concerned, I agree with you that John Bates Clark took side against slavery, for instance. And just to add some points, Small, for instance. Yeah. And Small was agreed with Eli on that issue. I'm just going to read the question from Cleo, because it seemed that the audience was not able to see it. So Cleo asked, what do you think of the AEA decision to rename the Eli lecture the AEA Distinguished Lecture Series, and more generally on the difference between celebration and history? So this was the question.
And the excerpt, you should read it until the end. The excerpt from the AEA announcement of the decision, quote, the ad hoc committee noted that although Ely made positive contribution to economic thought, he also wrote approvingly of slavery and eugenics, in weight against immigrants and favored segregation. And this is, of course, absolutely true. I mean, well, you have to know that most of the social gospelists of the time were progressive on the idea that you needed labor regulations, but rather anti-Semitic, which is a traditional bias of both Catholic and North American Protestant churches against immigrants, and rather in favor of eugenics. So it was a general problem of the time of them.
Thank you, Annie.
If there are no other questions, I have some questions for the other, but let's ask the audience first.
Yes, if someone has a question, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you, or I can read your question.
If I can just comment, since Annie mentioned that I might have something to add about economists at the time who were not eugenicists. A notable figure was Emily Greenbulch of Wellesley College, who later shared the Nobel Peace Prize for her anti-war and social reform activism. Won the prize in 1946 for the same reason she lost her professorship in 1918. And she was very
both
much
a woman and a Jew.
Yeah, that's a woman. Well, she wasn't Jewish, but in this case, Quaker, woman and Quaker, standing up, in particular for Slavic immigrants. As to Stephen Leacock, I just mentioned that the historian Margaret Macmillan, writing about Leacock, found it worthy of note that anti-Semitism seemed to be the only prejudice of the time that Leacock did not share.
Thank you. We've got a question from Justin Cacqueux.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I want to know, is there a connection between the concept of eugenist and the concept of Pareto efficiency in economics?
The origins, Pareto efficiency definitely comes from, analytically, from a general equilibrium framework. And the eugenic movements definitely come from a Darwinian versus Galton or Spencer social Darwinism mixed with this global racism, which was very common at the end of the 19th century. So Pareto himself was, of course, as you know, ended his life as a fascist member of the parliament in Italy for the last year of his life. But the the origin of the eugenic movement is definitely different from Pareto's optimality.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking the question is because sometimes I feel like the concept of Pareto efficiency is a way to conserve, the status quo, the social order.
Well, all the laissez-faire economists of the time were rather conservative in the sense of conserving. They wanted to conserve the status quo, so status quo in English. So this is not enough. I'm speaking of the intellectual roots or origins, or matrix. The Pareto efficiency, well, if Pareto was conservative and eugenists were conservative, but it was not this, and racist were, and blah, blah, blah. But I mean, a lot of people were, but it's not the same type of intellectual origin. That would be my answer.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question for Steve, one for Guillaume and one for Bob. So whenever there is no question from the audience, I'll be glad to ask them.
Yes, Annie, please feel free to ask them because there is no question for now.
My question from Steve is, how do you explain? I mean, well, your last point being that George illuminates the progressive era by contrast on what progressivism is not, is a very interesting point. How would you explain this extremely interesting fame of Henry George's in Europe in a totally different context? This is one thing we should discuss together, which is that in France, of course, but in all European countries, Henry George was widely read and widely discussed among all American economists of the time.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Annie. And thanks too for your presentation, which helps me to see George better by contrast specifically with Ely. I should have known, and maybe once I did know, but even if I did, I forgot that Ely wrote the labor movement in America at exactly the same moment as protection or free trade. And so it's interesting to contrast the way both of them were thinking simultaneously about the labor movement at that moment. As for George's popularity in Europe, I think it's owing to people's desire to understand the problem, to believe that the problem is understandable by themselves, and to contribute to a mass movement that would institute an understandable reform that would solve the problem. The existence of such a reform that could solve everything is remarkably appealing. Even more if it's built upon economic principles that show why ostensibly we've all got it wrong, why all this dispute that we've been embroiled in on a particular issue up to now is fruitless. I think people want to believe that already. At least there are people, and there's a part of the mind that receives that kind of an argument well. And then George himself was a brilliant rhetorician. He had, I think it was to his advantage that he was an autodidact, that he worked as a newspaper man for some years, that he read literature. And I argue elsewhere that you can read Henry George in the same vein that you read the novelists who contribute to the movement of American literary realism. He was really that good, that evocative, and one of the reasons why I put the woodcut in my presentation was that it shows as a visual depiction of that metaphor, George's talent for metaphor, how good he was at reaching people. So I would say it's that combination of things, the desire of people almost innately to believe that fruitless political discussions can be surpassed, and to to be persuaded that there's a great reform, a single reform, which once instituted will solve the problem.
There is also the question of the land. I mean, if you take Valras, who is the opposite to Henry George on many questions on what you lectured today on, which is tariffs and trades and laissez-faire, Valras was very interested on the possibility of using land as the major mean for social reform. But his solution was to nationalize the land, to give the land to the state, and hence to free all of the citizens from any type of taxes. Yeah. So the status, I think George was also important because he did put the land at the center, the heart of his system, which was not the case for the other economists of his time. Mm-hmm. We'll discuss that.
I agree.
Later. Are there other questions, or can I go on?
No, I think you can go on.
I have a question for Bob, which is, it's extremely, Leacock is I never read a line on Leacock. I didn't even know he existed because I'm totally inculte. How do you say inculte to that culture? Canadian economist. But it's extremely interesting, this mixture, which reminds me of how some women in the 19th century got into economic theory by translation, novels, articles, and in general public journals and all that. My question is there something of a theoretical originality in his ideas or in his policy propositions, or is it just this mix between his academic life and his literary life as a humorist and as a novelist, which is fascinating in Leacock? I mean, in other words, through all this game between the two fields of intervention, are there some original ideas in Leacock's theories?
I don't think he was original as an economist, but is a political scientist. He had some claim to originality in putting together the program of reform in the Unsolved Riddle of social justice, and also, though it never had any practical consequences, his views for the reorganization of the British Empire so that it would no longer be just for the benefit of Britain, but that the colonies would be fuller participants in running the empire and in benefiting for it. But really, he was not original or even truly qualified to be original as an economist, but as a social scientist, as a political scientist. He had more credentials and more standing and simply more command of the arguments and the methods of analysis. I mean, it's purely an accident of it being a joint department and a joint professorship that he was perceived publicly and perceived by himself as an economist. If he if one were to think of him as a political scientist, then he's a far more serious scholar and serious social scientist. But it was paradoxical that he was mistaken for an economist, and of course he mistook himself for an economist as well. It's also the case that if you look at his 1936 book denouncing mathematical economics and use fads like Keynes, elements of economics and hiccups of verse, he was also apparently, I would say, quite unjustified in regarding himself as a poet. His credentials as a poet were as limited as his credentials as an economist. But what is being overlooked in thinking of him as just a humorist and not an economist is that it was a joint appointment in economics and political science, and his standing in political science and his ability and his understanding of the arguments and analysis of political science were quite serious and quite solid. But all his originality is, I think, in political analysis, not in economics as such. But there's also a considerable difference in disciplinary boundaries in Canada from the United States, partly because of the smaller size of the academic community in Canada. The different academic disciplines become truly distinct a lot later in Canada than in the United States. And we were talking about Ely and the foundation of the American Economics Association. Well, the Canadian Economics Association doesn't exist as a separate entity until 1966. Until then, it's part of the Canadian Political Science Association. The journal is the Canadian Journal of Economics and Political Science. Lots of the major universities like University of Toronto, University of Saskatchewan, McGill have a single Department of Political Economy at Toronto, Department of Economics and Political Science at McGill and Saskatchewan. And there are a number of people like Harold Innes, whom one might think of in retrospect as much as being historians rather than economists, who are in these departments. The disciplinary boundaries are much less distinct in Canada until a considerably later period than in the United States.
This is very interesting, yes. What is interesting with Ely is that on the one hand, he launches the American Economic Association. On the other hand, he launches this school of economics, political science, and history, and advocates in favor of rejoining economics together with legal studies, history, sociology, very strongly. This is the German matrix. But so he has both this professionalization of economists on the one hand, and this need for a multidisciplinary view on economic questions on the other. And I have a last question for Guillaume, if I still have some time.
Yeah, you still have some time, but we've got another question for Bob.
So let's have the question for Bob first.
Thank you, Annie. Ivan Velasquez wants to ask you a question. Ivan, can you ask your question? Are you able to talk or not? Okay, so I'm going to, is it okay, Ivan? Ivan? We cannot hear you, so I'm going to read your, maybe your question, if I find it. Ivan wanted to ask you, Bob, what is your take about the loss of irony in the writings of institutional school and economics in general as a way to connect with the general public?
Well, I think Galbraith was right, because Galbraith is the figure in institutional economics who is the most humorous, the one who uses satire and irony most effectively to gain an audience after Veblen and Leacock. And I think Galbraith has a point reflecting that irony and humor are effective for getting an audience, for getting attention, but they're not as that effective in persuading anybody. And the problem with Leacock was a tremendous satirist, tremendous sense of irony. He could get lots and lots of people to publish his work, to read his work, to listen to his lectures, to do everything except take him seriously. The use of irony, it's wonderfully amusing. He has many, many people reading him. There were, in his lifetime, lots of people coming to his lectures. And they have made up their minds in advance that it's all going to be a joke. So that it's wonderful irony, and his audience persists in treating it strictly as humor. And Galbraith, Douglas Galbraith, who's, I think, very conscious of Leacock, especially the Sunshine Sketches of a little town. Leacock's problem was also Galbraith's problem, that thousands and thousands of readers, but they're reading him for amusement. They are convinced in advance it's going to be entertainment, and rather than taking the message as seriously as it is intended. Of course, there are also many people reading Galbraith seriously and paying attention to his message, but beyond that, he has a large audience of people who have decided in advance that it's going to be just amusement, that they're reading the works of an entertainer. So irony doesn't work nearly as well for getting people to absorb the serious message as it works for getting people to listen in the first place, because they'll listen, they'll read it, but they'll assume that it's going to be just entertainment. And this is also a problem for Veblen communicating his message, because Veblen has a very serious message to convey about how society works, about exploitation, and about the economics profession. And yet, because he does so in an extremely entertaining way, if you happen to share his sense of humor, many of his readers just treat it as entertainment, as amusement.
Thank you, Bob. So Annie, now you can ask your question to me if you want.
Yes, it's still on the same subject than the question I had for Steve, which is the North American European link, because some of the topics that you mentioned about small were highly discussed in Europe at the same time. I'm thinking of Valras on the equality of opportunity, but everything I know on Albion Small, apart from what you just said, basically comes from Darcy Russ's book, The Origins of American Social Science, that I've been reading a long time ago, so my memory is not very precise. But if I remember well, she has a whole chapter on Albion Small, and she insists upon his role in this development of the theme of American exceptionalism. Did you meet this idea in your reading of Small? Because this was something highly discussed in the pre-progressive era, and of course in the progressive era. And it has to do with what we've been saying, both on the comparison with between European thinkers and American thinkers, and what Steve was saying about Henry George as the anti-progressive position. So is progressivism specifically an American exception? I'm not sure, but this is my opinion, it's not yours. And is Albion Small a strong author on this theme?
Thank you very much, Annie, for this very interesting question. As I said, Small was influenced by many scholars, but especially from Europe, he was really influenced by German scholars. He was not in connection with Durkheim, for instance, in sociology. Small mentioned Durkheim only twice in his seminal book, General Sociology, published in 1905. And then the connections came from Germany. And when he came back from Germany, I think Small had in mind to do the same in the US than the German scholars did in Germany. So I think he did not believe in an American exceptionalism at the beginning of his career. But in my view, what changed him for good was the First World War, because he was very disappointed with German scholars, with the attitude of Germany. And I think from this time, he started to believe that there could be an American exceptionalism, and that America has to devise its own policies and its own way according to the American context only. So from the First World War, he lost many connections with German scholars, and then he really changed his mind.
This is, I mean, American exceptionalism is wider than just the relationship between small and Germany. It was really a theme which was discussed. I mean, if you take Ross's book, Dorothy Ross's book, it was really for her, one of the central, I remember a discussion by Bob Coates explaining that this was a stupid theme for a book, but this was Bob Coates' opinion. But it was a theme which was important at the time. So it's not enough to just say he was influenced by his German.
Of course, but no, to my knowledge, did not really mention this issue of American exceptionalism. So we've got 5 minutes. Yes, there are still 5 minutes if some people want to ask some questions. No. I've got one question for you, Annie, if I may.
Yes, of course.
Because in your presentation, you mentioned the role of Christianity in Ely's thought and views. It was very important. And do you think that Ely was maybe too much close to these morals during his career, in the sense that some people such as Newcomb attacked him, for instance, accusing him to be too close to these morals and then being not scientific enough? Or do you think it was a kind of ethics of conviction which was really useful in his career?
Basically, do you hear me? Yeah. For Ely, it is the major matrix. I mean, if he is a socialist, if he's in favor of trade unions, if he considered that the labor problem is important, it is in the name of his Christian, more than faith, of his Christian ethics, philosophy. It is the basic matrix for Ely's work. Newcomb's attack against Ely after the labor movement in America, I read the article, is definitely because he considered that Ely is a socialist and anarchist in favor of labor union, and that labor union was just radical, and it was immigrant leftist movement coming from Europe with revolutionary ideas. Newcomb was definitely it's very American to say a laissez-faire economist. In Europe, we don't use the term, but he was definitely a laissez-faire and conservative in the sense that was used before, which is wanting to conserve the social order. So attacking the labor movement in America was not attacking Ely on his social gospel or Christian faith. Part of the Protestant community also attacked Ely and some of the social gospelists for their left-wing or social reform views. So it was, I mean, for Ely, this Christianity was definitely a matrix, a moral, philosophy, ethical matrix. But for his opponents, he was not attacked on this ground. He was attacked for his so-called socialism, the discussion of what socialism was being a very harsh and strong debate at that time, the definition of socialism, and Ely was part of it. But half of Ely's book were on social reform from a Christian perspective. So you cannot say it was too much or not too much. It was him. I mean, it's you take it. I mean, you cannot speak about Ely without speaking about this social gospel matrix, which was common to Commons, to Clarke the father. It was a rather common feature of some of those pre-progressive authors, some of those young rebels who went to Germany, or who had some masters who came from Germany, who went to Germany to study, to be part of this social gospel movement. Again, I think that what Brad Bateman wrote, I mean, a lot of them, if you take Rader's biography of Ely, he has 3 chapters on his Christianity.
I have
Excuse me to disrupt you, Annie, but the session is going to close because
sorry,
we are going to be cut off. I just want to thank you for everyone for this participation, the speakers, of course, and the audience. And I really hope you learned a lot with the different presentations. So thank you so much, and be progressive. Thank you.